Again, there are some personalities who start writing and talking about why Russia gave Norway a piece of the Barents Sea when Medvedev was president. And these people don't even try to figure it out. Apparently, their task is to throw more negativity into the information space. And thanks to this decision, Russia has acquired tens of thousands of square kilometers, which before were in the gray zone and could not be used by our country. But we'll come back to that a little later, but first we'll show you how the West is sometimes mispronounced. We recommend to watch the video to the end, as there will be all the most interesting things. So, Victoria Nolan's on the line. Russia in its current state does not meet the image they would like to see in the future. United States. This is not the Russia that, frankly, we wanted. We wanted to see a partner that would be oriented towards the West, that would become European. However, that is not what Putin has done, U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, Victoria Nuland, said on CNN. European Russia, in the view of hawks like this lady, is a country completely subordinate to the interests of the United States, like Germany or France. Or better yet, the 404 countries where Americans almost don't even have a semblance of decency. In this sense, it is possible to understand Nonad. The kaftan they made for us was not the right size, which the Deputy Secretary regrets very much. Looked pretty fancy, though. Our liberals are still enamored with the cut. This does not mean that we have beaten the pots with Europe for good and are on the right path of loving the East. We should stop falling in love altogether. To the West, to the East, to the South, to Latin America. It's time to grow out of your short pants, your childish ideas of how the world works. No one owes us anything. Profitable trading and profitable waiting to make an interesting offer. Enough friendship for centuries. In international relations. More than enough pragmatism. Notice that we don't believe the sweet talk of characters like Vika Nuland at all anymore. We already know for sure that any partnership with the United States is out of the question. They're only referring to the username vassal relationship. Do you think we have been completely cured of the diseases we have contracted since perestroika? I don't think so. Many of our citizens are already ready to embrace the Eastern countries and the Southern countries. But our centuries of experience with Europe should teach us a simple truth. You can't trust anyone. No one is obligated to be part of our partners and trade with us at a loss. And we're not at all calling for closure. That would be impractical. We suggest taking off the rose-colored glasses, smashing them, and even stopping on them. And finally start to look at the world around us soberly, noticing its imperfections. You and I are ready to restore relations with Europe. By the way, the question is not so premature. If the Americans come to their senses, carefully calculate the losses from hegemony and deal with their domestic problems, the subcontinent will remain derelict. Somebody's gonna have to clean it up. Purely emotional. I don't want to get involved in their internal affairs. Let them rot any way they want. With its migrants, rabid refugees, and economic problems. But I guess I'll have to. And that's for decades. So Victoria Nuland is right, of course, to train Russia like the EU. They didn't make it, and it never will. But we also have lessons to learn. We, for example, are not at all against the suzerain-vassal relationship. Only if Russia is the suzerain. It remains to convince the Europeans that it is nicer and more profitable to be our reunions than American ones. Which is true, by the way. Well, now let's get back to the question of why Russia gave Norway a piece of the Barents Sea. Norway is not just a NATO country, it is one of the founding members of NATO. In 1949, Norway and 11 other countries formed a military bloc to oppose the Soviet Union. Then there was the Cold War, then all sorts of unfriendly moves by NATO countries against Russia, like supporting terrorists in Chechnya, supporting Georgia in 2008, expanding to our borders, including in the former Soviet Union, and a host of sanctions, many of which were well before 2014. And despite all this, in 2010, President Medvedev allegedly gave in quotes to Norway about 90,000 square kilometers of the Barents Sea, which is 3 times the area of Crimea. This circumstance has now surfaced amid the hysteria about the expulsion of British fishermen from Russian territorial waters. Here's what the detractors write, quote, "Why does Volodin blame the Soviet regime and not Medvedev, who gave Norway the waters of the Barents Sea?" End of article. Agree. Doesn't look right. It's really weird. Medvedev didn't just allow fishing, in quotes, he literally gave up 90,000 square kilometers of water area of the Barents Sea, along with all the fish and, as the same authors write, along with the 2 billion barrels of hydrocarbons, estimated at $30 billion, discovered there already in 2013. We have always been surprised by the doublethink of Russia's critics. After all, they first tell us that the Russian authorities who own the oil and gas industry think only about money, about profit. How to cheat the people, how to take over everything. And then these same people say that the Russian authorities took and just for no reason allegedly gave up 2 billion barrels of hydrocarbons worth $30 billion. Even at the level of banal logic, you do not find it strange that the greedy authorities took and made such a gift to unknown people. After all, that's exactly how it's all built. Sitting, such as say Medvedev, sat and thought, and what could I do to make myself even richer? Oh, I'll give 90,000 square kilometers to Norway. That's a great solution. Is that what it all looks like? No, of course not. Although if you look at the issue from our patriotic side and don't look into it, it also makes little sense. Russian reputation. The authorities are thinking about how to make Russia stronger and oppose the West. And after 2008, this confrontation became obvious and imminent. But then he goes and makes some weird gifts to a NATO country. In general, everything is somehow complicated, not as the above authors try to suggest. So, as usual, let's get to the heart of the matter of what Medvedev actually gave away. It all started in 1926, when Comrade Stalin drew the maritime border between the Soviet Union and Norway with the stroke of a pen. It seems that Stalin also had a ruler in addition to his pen, because he drew the border in the so-called meridian or sectoral principle, when the border is simply set along meridians and parallels. Very convenient, especially at sea. You just look at your latitude and longitude and know where you are very fond of such boundaries. In the United States, for example, most of the USA-Canada border lies just on a parallel. An interstate is often the same principle. Norway has not really protested against this way of drawing the border. Couldn't have protested in those days, I guess. In 1970, however, the Norwegians caught on. The fact is that the law of the sea actually provides for a different way of drawing boundaries. It is based on the principle of equidistance. That is, the border is drawn exactly in the middle between the islands and other land belonging to the countries. Here, for example, is an island of Norway and an island of Russia, and the border is strictly in the middle. So in terms of the convention, the border should have been roughly as follows. Like this. Stalin's red border line, black border on the principle of equidistance. Norway had decided to rely on international law. There was a territorial dispute over the water area of about 175,000 square kilometers. Moreover, this dispute was not in favor of the Soviet Union. Norway claimed the part of the Barents Sea that the Union considered its own. It is important to understand that Stalin's border was not recognized by any country in the world except the Soviet Union itself. International conventions mandated the drawing of a border, exactly the Norwegian way. As a result, in 1975, the Soviet Union and Norway agreed that the disputed territory would become a kind of no man's land. Exploration, oil and gas production by either party was prohibited in this zone. In this gray zone since 1975, no one could not explore or produce any hydrocarbons. I mean, it was like a pear you couldn't eat. Also note that 1975 was the time of the Soviet Union's maximum power. In military, in political, and economic. It really was a superpower. Norway was then nothing at all in terms of international weight. But even with such initial data, the Soviet Union could not just brush it off and say, yes, we forgot to ask you, the sea is ours and the oil is ours. No, it doesn't work that way. The Soviet Union was forced to make concessions. And so in 2010, Medvedev and Stoltenberg, yes, the same one, he was the head of Norway at the time, agreed to do this. Divide the disputed territory roughly in half, 87,500 square kilometers each. After that, to fix the obtained border without mutual claims and with the removal of all restrictions on oil and gas exploration. The red line of the border agreed upon. The black line on the right and left are the former disputed boundaries. It was called a delimitation agreement. In Norway, it was seen as a great success. Yes, and Russia willingly voted in favor of ratification, too. Thus the territorial dispute was settled. A border recognized by all the countries of the world has been established. So what did it give Russia? First, Russia still left behind almost 90,000 square kilometers that were previously gray and could not be used. Now they can. Second, Russia has shown itself to be a party to international law that has complied with the conventions. Although, I repeat, according to these conventions, all 175,000 square kilometers should have gone to Norway. The fact that we left ourselves 90,000 square kilometers is also a small, but an achievement. And then someone sighed, honey. So once again we want to appear good. Once again we are sucking up to the world community. Once again we think that the West has partners. Why do we need this status of an honest international player and so on? The thing is that such a status is not just a diploma on the wall, which you look at and admire. Such a status leads to specific benefits. For example, 9 years before the events described above, in 2001, Russia applied to recognize a huge area of the Sea of Okhotsk as Russian. Before that, the central part of the sea was neutral and Russia could not produce oil and gas there, although there is 4 times more oil there than in the part of the Barents Sea allegedly given to Norway. There are 8 billion barrels in the Sea of Okhotsk versus 2 billion in the Barents Sea, plus 2 trillion cubic meters of gas. There are also a lot of fish in the Sea of Okhotsk, more than in the Barents Sea. Briefly, it's a very fat piece, but the UN has been slow to recognize this part of the Sea of Okhotsk as Russia's. Motivation? This includes unsettled borders with its neighbors, i.e. Norway. Settled the border and things got going. In the year 2000, the UN recognized Russia's rights to the Sea of Okhotsk, and in 2014, by the way, on March 15, 2014, 3 days before the annexation of Crimea, the sea officially passed to us along with all the oil and gas. But what's that? Also in 2010, Russia was actively eyeing a huge part of the Arctic Ocean floor called the Lomonosov Ridge and the Medvedev Rise. There we are already talking about millions of square kilometers, and the amount of oil and gas is dozens of times greater than even in the Sea of Okhotsk. Russian scientists and diplomats are busy proving that Russia has a right to this part of the Arctic as well. But without a settled border with the same Norway, it would be difficult to count on UN approval. Yes, it's understandable that, with current events, it's hard to count on anything. But in 2010, no one knew about it, and the odds were very good. But it's not just about oil and gas. Let's think about the Northern Sea route. It runs just across the Barents Sea and crosses the Russia-Norway border. We are trying to make it internationally attractive so that ships all over the world will use it. But how do you use it if it goes through a gray area? The territorial dispute does not contribute in any way to the development of international trade routes. In total, as a result of the gift that Medvedev allegedly made to Norway, first of all, Russia unblocked 90,000 square kilometers, which before were in the gray zone and could not be used. Secondly, Russia got the right to the Sea of Okhotsk, which is several times richer. Third, Russia got a better chance to get rights to the Lomonosov Ridge and the Medvedev Rise. Fourth, the Northern Sea route can be actively developed. So was it a favorable gift, in quotation marks? In our opinion, very much so. The sequel follows.